Have you ever watched Inglourious Basterds and been impressed by Lieutenant ALDO RAINE? A cold, calculated leader, a man who seemed to live for war, who commanded his men in the middle of chaos with an almost unsettling confidence. Now let me tell you something. What if I told you that this kind of leader was not just a creation of Hollywood? That there was a real man, even more daring, even more dangerous, who not only led his soldiers on the most impossible missions of the Second World War, and who struck fear into the Germans. A commander who advanced through terrain no one dared to cross, attacked positions considered impossible, and left a trail of respect and fear wherever he went. This is the story of one of the most feared and respected leaders of the war. And what you are about to see here feels like fiction, but it is not. Before continuing, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this need to be told. He shouldn't have been there. That's the first thing you need to understand. Because long before he was feared by enemies, long before he led one of the most brutal units of the Second World War, Frederick was just another officer stuck behind a desk, inside the military system itself. While thousands of soldiers were being sent to the battlefield, while the war was already consuming Europe, he was far from all of that, analyzing reports, studying plans, living a routine that had nothing to do with real combat. And maybe that's exactly why his story begins in such a different way. Because no one looked at that man and thought about war. No one imagined that there was someone capable of leading impossible attacks. Someone who would step into enemy territory knowing he might not come back. Someone who would completely change the way war would be fought. But it was exactly in that scenario, far from chaos, far from explosions, that everything started to change. Amid papers, strategies, and decisions made at a distance, an idea emerged. A proposal that looked more like an experiment than a real operation. A bold plan, almost absurd, that involved creating a unit completely different from anything that had existed up to that point. It would not be a common army. It would not follow traditional rules. And it definitely would not be sent on simple missions. The proposal was clear: infiltrate, attack, disappear, operate where no one else could, and survive where most would fail. It was, in other words, a mission that many considered impossible. And the most curious thing of all is that Frederick himself knew it. He analyzed the plan, understood the risks, saw the flaws, and even so, he did not back down. Because at that moment, something changed. The man who once lived far from the war was now about to step into its most dangerous place. That's when the decision came that would change everything. Instead of choosing traditional soldiers, men trained only to follow orders. Frederick began to look for something different, something that completely escaped the military standard of that time. He wanted men who already knew how to survive even before wearing a uniform. Men used to extreme cold, to impossible terrain, to situations where making a mistake meant dying. Lumberjacks, hunters, explorers, men who were not afraid of silence, who did not need comfort, who knew how to move in the dark without being seen. It wasn't just recruitment, it was the construction of something new, something that the army itself did not yet fully understand. And maybe that was exactly what made everything even more dangerous, because no one knew how far that could go. And then the training began. And that's where reality finally showed itself. There was no rest. There was no clear limit, only constant tests, physical and mental, pushing each man to the breaking point. Climbing frozen mountains, long marches carrying extreme weight, hand-to-hand combat, silent infiltration, everything designed to turn those men into something different, something closer to an invisible force than a conventional army. And at the center of all that was him, not watching from afar, not just giving orders, but participating, testing, demanding, showing that if that was going to work, he would be the first to cross the line of danger. What no one realized at that moment is that that unit, still without a name, still without an identity, was about to become one of the most feared in the entire war. Because that wasn't just a group of soldiers, it was the beginning of something bigger, something that would completely change the way special operations would be conducted in the future. But before that, they still needed to prove one thing, that all of that was not just an experiment, that that seemingly impossible idea could work in practice. And when that moment came, there would be no room for error. There would be no second chance, because the first mission would define everything. The first mission didn't begin with gunfire. It began with silence. A heavy, strange silence. Almost uncomfortable. Because for the first time, everything that had been trained to the limit would leave paper and enter the real world. And this is where the story starts to gain a different rhythm. Because before that, everything was still preparation, theory, endurance. But now, it was war. The initial destination of that newly formed unit seemed, at first glance, less threatening than what would come later. The Aleutian Islands, more specifically Kiska, a remote, cold, isolated place where nature itself was already an enemy. But what seemed like a simple mission quickly turned into something that would reveal an important truth. War is not predictable. It never was. When they arrived, ready to face the enemy, they discovered something unexpected. The Japanese had already abandoned the island. No direct combat, no confrontation, only emptiness, silence, and the strange feeling that all that preparation had not yet truly been tested. But that did not mean failure. Quite the opposite. That operation served to show something essential, that that unit could move, adapt, operate under extreme conditions, and above all, be ready. Because the real test was still to come, and it would have nothing empty about it, nothing silent, nothing easy. The next destination would completely change the course of the story. Italy, a completely different scenario, where every meter of land was contested, where the enemy was prepared, armed, and waiting. And it was there that Frederick and his men finally understood what it really meant to put that training to the test. When they arrived at the Italian front line, reality was brutal. Allied troops had already tried to advance and failed repeatedly. The terrain favored the Germans, the positions were fortified, and any direct attempt resulted in heavy losses. It was the kind of situation that stalled entire armies, the kind of scenario where traditional strategies simply did not work. And it is exactly at this point that that different unit, that force that did not follow common rules, begins to make sense. Because while others saw an impossible obstacle, Frederick saw an opportunity, not for direct confrontation, but for rupture, for doing the unexpected, for attacking where no one even dared to try. And that's how one of the most risky decisions of the entire war emerged. facing a mountain considered impossible to climb, naturally protected by its own difficulty. Frederick did something few would do. He decided to attack exactly from there, without heavy support, without an easy path, just men, ropes, darkness, and a plan that, if it failed, would leave no survivors to tell the story. It was a choice that completely ignored traditional logic, but that fit perfectly with the type of war that unit had been created to fight. And once again, he did not stay behind, did not observe from afar. He was there, among the men, climbing, step by step, knowing that any mistake meant falling, death, or worse, being discovered before the attack even began. The climb happened during the night, in complete silence. Every movement calculated, every breath controlled. Because at that moment, their greatest ally was exactly what the enemy did not expect. The possibility of someone emerging from where there simply should not be a passage. And that is exactly what happened. When the attack began, there was no warning. There was no preparation on the other side. Only chaos. German soldiers completely caught off guard, not understanding where the attack was coming from, facing a force that seemed to emerge from the shadows, fast, precise, lethal. In just a few hours, what had once been considered impossible was taken. And at that moment, something changed forever. It was no longer an experimental unit, no longer a group trying to prove its value. Now they were real, and more than that, they were dangerous, because they had just shown something that few believed possible, that war could be won not only with strength, but with intelligence, boldness, and an almost insane willingness to do what no one else would do. And it was exactly there, in that attack, on that mountain, that something greater than a simple victory began to be born. A reputation, a legend, that would soon cross enemy lines and spread among those who would begin to fear the name of that unit, even without ever having seen them up close. After that first impossible victory, something changed definitively, not only inside the unit, but also in the way they were seen, both by allies and enemies. Because until that moment, they were still a bet, a risky idea, an experiment that could go wrong at any time. But now, they had proven something essential, that they could do what no one else could. And when that happens in the middle of a war, there is no going back. From that point on, they stopped being an alternative and became a necessity. Whenever a mission appeared that was too difficult, too dangerous, or simply too unlikely, it was them that command looked to. And that is exactly how the most intense phase, the most brutal, and the most dangerous part of this unit's story began. The scenario was now even more complex, more pressured, more chaotic. The front lines in Italy were stalled. The Allied advance was slow, costly, and every position gained came with heavy losses. And it is in this environment that Frederick and his men truly enter the heart of the war. No longer as an experimental force, but as a tool of rupture, sent to break what seemed unbreakable. Night missions became routine, silent infiltrations, fast attacks, ambushes, disappearing before the enemy could react. It was a completely different pattern of combat, a type of war that confused, destabilized, and, above all, mentally exhausted the enemy. And it was at this moment that something even more powerful than any tactical victory emerged. Fear. Because the Germans began to notice a pattern, positions being attacked during the night, soldiers disappearing, attacks that came out of nowhere, without warning, without preparation, without apparent logic. It was not a direct confrontation. It was something harder to understand, harder to fight. And when an army begins to not understand what it is facing, it begins to fear. That's how the first reports appeared. Whispers, stories spreading among enemy troops about men who appeared in the darkness with painted faces, silent, fast, lethal, and who disappeared before anyone could react. It didn't take long for those reports to gain a name, a nickname that carried exactly the feeling they caused: Black Devils. And while that reputation grew on the other side, inside the unit, reality was completely different. There was no glamour, no heroism like in the movies. There was extreme fatigue, constant tension, and the awareness that any mistake, no matter how small, could be fatal. Because this type of war does not allow distractions, does not allow hesitation. It demands absolute precision, all the time. And even so, Frederick continued doing what made him different from all other commanders. He did not step away, did not retreat to safe positions. He was there, with his men, in the missions, in the infiltrations, in the silent nights before the attack. Leading by example, but also taking the same risk as everyone around him. It was during this period that operations intensified even more, especially in regions where control of terrain was crucial. Fortified areas, difficult defensive lines, strategic positions that blocked Allied advance, and once again, while other units were stalled. Frederick did something different. Instead of facing directly, he broke the pattern, attacked where there was no defense, appeared where no one expected, turning the terrain itself into an ally. It was a way of thinking that went beyond strength. It was pure strategy, combined with an almost perfect execution. And the result of that was clear. Positions fell, advances happened, and the presence of that unit began to shift the balance in critical points of the conflict. But what truly solidified the legend was the fact that all of this happened repeatedly. It was not a stroke of luck. It was not an isolated victory. It was consistency. Mission after mission, night after night, they kept doing what seemed impossible. And the more they did, the more fear grew on the other side. Because there was no way to predict, no way to prepare, no way to know when they would strike or where they would come from. And when war reaches this level, it stops being only physical. It becomes psychological. And in this type of war, fear can be as devastating as any weapon. And it is exactly here that the story reaches a new level. Because while the legend grew, while the name Black Devils spread among enemies, Frederick and his men were about to face the most extreme scenario of all, a place where there was no rest, where the line between survival and collapse was constantly tested, where the war gave no pause, not for a single day, a place that would test not only their strength, but everything they had built until that point. Anzio. If until now the war already seemed brutal, in Anzio it stops being only brutal and becomes suffocating. Because there was no clear advance there, no defined front line, no rest. It was a stalemate, a dead point, where both sides were stuck, watching each other, waiting, and attacking constantly. And it is exactly in this kind of scenario, where everything seems frozen, that exhaustion begins to destroy not only the body, but the mind. Days turn into nights, nights turn into days, and nothing changes. Only gunfire, explosions, tension, and the constant feeling that at any moment something could happen. It was in this environment that Frederick and his men entered, and what they found there was completely different from anything they had faced before. For 99 days, there was no pause. 99 days of continuous combat, of constant pressure, of successive missions, with no space for real recovery. And that changes everything, because it is no longer about a quick operation, a planned attack. It becomes pure endurance, survival, continuing even when the body no longer responds the same way. Even when fatigue begins to affect decisions, reflexes, perception. And even so, they kept going. Night missions became routine, silent infiltrations followed by fast attacks, always in the same pattern. Enter, cause damage, leave before the enemy reacts. But in Anzio, that was not just strategy, it was necessity. Because staying still meant becoming a target. And this is where psychological warfare reaches its peak. Because the Germans already knew who they were facing. They had heard the stories. They knew the pattern. They knew that when night came, something could emerge from nowhere. And even so, they could not stop it. They could not predict it. They could not control it. That creates a different kind of fear, a constant, silent fear that does not depend on a major attack, but on the possibility of an attack at any moment. And when that fear settles, it begins to corrode everything: discipline, confidence, stability. And that is exactly what began to happen. Reports started to emerge, positions being abandoned, soldiers retreating without clear orders, exaggerated reactions to any movement, any sound, any shadow. Because it was not just about facing an enemy, it was about facing something that did not follow the normal pattern of war. Something that appeared when no one expected, attacked with precision, and disappeared before any response could be organized. And while that was happening on the German side, on Frederick's side, the pressure was equally brutal, but in a different way. Because maintaining that level of operation for so long required something beyond training. It required absolute control, discipline, and leadership capable of keeping everything functioning even under extreme exhaustion. And once again, he was there, not distant, not protected, but present, in the same environment, under the same risk, in the same sleepless nights, leading as he always had, by example. And that has a direct effect, because in an environment where everything pressures, where everything wears down, knowing that the commander is there, facing the same danger, completely changes how men respond. It does not eliminate fear. It does not reduce exhaustion, but it creates something stronger, a silent trust, a sense that if he continues, then it is still possible to continue as well. But even with all of that, Anzio takes its toll. Injuries happen, losses happen, physical and mental exhaustion accumulates. And it is at this point that the story becomes even more impressive, because Frederick does not just lead, he endures, even wounded, even exposed. He continues, remains active, remains present, as if retreating were simply not an option. And that reinforces even more the image that was already forming, not only among his men, but also among enemies. Because on the other side, he was no longer seen as a common commander, but as someone who seemed impossible to stop. And at the end of those 99 days, what remains is not just the tactical result, but the impact. Because the presence of that unit, in that scenario, completely changed the local dynamic. Not only through attacks, but through continuous psychological effect, through the exhaustion caused, through the instability created. And when a unit can do that, when it can influence enemy behavior in that way, it stops being only effective and becomes strategic. And that is exactly what takes the story to the next level. Because after Anzio, Frederick is no longer just the leader of a special unit. He is a reference, someone who has proven repeatedly that his way of fighting works. And when that happens in the middle of war, new opportunities arise, new challenges appear, and the level of responsibility increases. Because now, it is no longer just about leading a select group, but about taking on something even bigger, something that would place him on a new level and take him directly into one of the final phases of the war, where everything would be decided and where the legend would finally be fully solidified. After Anzio, there were no more doubts. The name Robert Frederick was no longer circulating only among his men. It was no longer restricted to internal reports. It had gone beyond that. Now, he was seen as someone capable of changing the course of entire operations, someone who had already proven, repeatedly, that he could do what others could not. And in the middle of a war where results were everything, that carried enormous weight. That is exactly why, at that moment, his path takes a new direction, a leap that few officers managed in such a short time. He stops being just the commander of a special unit and takes on something even bigger, a responsibility that demanded not only courage, but vision, control, and the ability to lead at a completely different level. With only 30-something years, he was already commanding a much larger force, an entire division. That alone was already something unusual, but in his case, it made sense, because it was not just about hierarchy. It was about trust. Trust built in the field, under fire, under pressure, in situations where wrong decisions meant death. And now, that trust was being tested in a new phase of the war, southern France. A new scenario, new conditions, but with the same level of risk, or even greater, because at that point, the conflict was already moving toward its end, and every movement was decisive. It was during this phase that one of the most impressive episodes of his entire trajectory happened. The plan involved an airborne operation, a parachute jump, something that, for many officers in that position, would already be avoided. But not for him. Frederick decided to participate, not just coordinate, but be there in the middle of the operation. And that alone says a lot. Because leading from above is one thing. Leading in the middle of action is something completely different. But the situation quickly went beyond what was expected. During the jump, something went wrong, and he landed violently, resulting in severe injuries. A moment that, for any other commander, would mean immediate withdrawal, replacement. But not for him, even injured, even physically compromised. He refuses to leave. He continues, stays in command, organizes, leads, as if nothing had happened. And that kind of attitude, at that level, does not just impress, it reinforces something that had been built since the beginning. The image of someone who simply does not stop, who does not retreat, who does not abandon, who does not step away, even when everything indicates he should. And that has a direct impact, not only on his men, but on the entire structure around him. Because when a leader acts like that, he redefines the standard. He raises the level of demand, not by words, but by example. And while that happens, operations continue to advance. Southern France begins to fall. Positions are taken. The Allied advance intensifies, and Frederick remains at the center of everything. Now, not only as the commander of a feared unit, but as a consolidated general, someone who no longer needs to prove anything, but who keeps delivering mission after mission. And it is at this point that the story reaches its peak. Because everything that started with an unlikely idea, with an experimental unit, with a plan that seemed impossible, now turns into concrete results, into real advancement, into direct impact on the end of the war. But what truly defines this moment is not just the victories, it is consistency. Because it was not a single operation. It was not a single episode. It was a sequence, a continuous construction of right decisions in wrong scenarios. And that is what separates a good commander from a legend. Because while many can get it right once, few can maintain that under constant pressure, under continuous risk, under extreme exhaustion. And Frederick did exactly that. And as the war approached its end, his role became even more relevant. Final advances, territories being retaken, the collapse of the enemy getting closer. But even at that moment, when everything already pointed to the end of the conflict, there was still room for critical decisions, for important operations, for moments that would define not only the end of the war, but also the legacy of those who took part in it. And it is exactly there, in the final chapters of that conflict, that Frederick steps into action once again, now in a different scenario, broader, more decisive. And that would definitively mark the closing of his journey within the war. When the war finally approached its end, the scenario was already different. The Allied advance was becoming more and more inevitable. Enemy lines began to collapse, and what was once organized resistance was slowly turning into breakdown. But that did not mean ease, quite the opposite. Because the final moments of a war are often the most unpredictable, the most dangerous, where pockets of resistance still exist, desperate decisions, and situations that can spiral out of control at any moment. And it is exactly in this context that Robert Frederick enters the final phase of his trajectory. Now, no longer as a promise, no longer as a gamble, but as a consolidated reality within the conflict. With command of an entire division, he advances toward the heart of Germany. Now, the scale was different. The level of responsibility was another, and every decision carried even greater weight. It was no longer about small infiltrations or isolated attacks. Now they were broad, strategic movements, directly impacting the overall advance of Allied forces. Cities were taken, positions were abandoned by the enemy. Thousands of German soldiers began to surrender in a scenario that no longer offered escape. And even so, Frederick continued operating the same way he always had. Present, active, involved, maintaining the standard that had brought him that far. It was during this advance that his troops reached one of the most striking places of the entire war, a place that represented, in a brutal way, everything the conflict had produced at its darkest. A concentration camp. There was no strategy, no tactics, no combat. There was reality, a harsh, silent, impossible to ignore reality. And at that moment, the war stopped being only a clash between armies and began to directly show the reason why all of that was being fought. Because more than conquering territory, more than winning battles, there was something bigger at stake, something that, until then, many soldiers only knew through reports, and now it was in front of them. This kind of experience changes everything. It changes how war is seen. It changes how each decision is understood. It changes the weight of every action. Because when you see the real consequences of a conflict, it stops being only strategic and becomes deeply human. And Frederick, who had already been through everything, who had faced the most extreme scenarios, now carried that moment as well, that impact, as the final part of his journey within the war. Shortly after, the collapse becomes complete. Germany surrenders. The conflict in Europe comes to an end, and what for years dominated the world finally ends. For many, this is the moment of relief, of return, of closure. But for those who were at the center of it all, like Frederick, the end of the war does not simply mean switching off, forgetting, moving on. Because what was lived, what was faced, what was seen, remains. And maybe that is exactly what makes the end of this story different. Because when you look at everything he built, everything he led, everything he faced, it becomes clear that Robert Frederick was not just another commander, not just another name within a massive conflict. He was part of a change, part of a new way of fighting, part of the origin of something that would continue to exist long after the war ended. Special forces, unconventional warfare, the idea that small, highly trained units can do what entire armies cannot. All of that carries, in some way, the mark of what was created back then, when everything still seemed impossible. But like every story of this kind, there is a price. Because the body demands, time demands, and everything that was endured during years of combat leaves marks, injuries, wear, physical consequences that do not disappear when the war ends, and that inevitably leads to a withdrawal, to an early end of a career, not by choice, but by necessity, a silent ending, far from the battlefield, but carrying everything that was lived there. And that's how this story ends. Not with one last shot, not with a grand final scene, but with a legacy. A legacy built in silence, in the darkness, in impossible missions, in decisions that few would have the courage to make. A legacy that did not remain only in the past, but that continues to exist in every special operation, in every unit that operates beyond the lines, in every mission that demands more than the ordinary. Because long before that became standard, someone had to do it first, and that someone was Robert Frederick.